Thanks everybody for being here, and it's so lovely to be in an in-person event and in the wonderful gallery space. And it's a big pleasure for me to be talking to Diana, whose work I've been a huge fan of and studied from afar for a really long time. And I think, yeah, as Kevin has said, the show is really exquisite, and there's such a range of topics that we could go into at different levels or different intersections. But yeah, we'll see how we're doing after 20 minutes if people have questions, and take it from there. So I'll just start by asking more broadly, Diana, obviously, you're often posed as an abstract expressionist and being very much part of that legacy and having concerns that manifest in an abstract way. But I'm just interested in your particular relationship to abstraction, because I know that it isn't straightforward. And again, it's more a matter of lines of inquiry around material perception or the materiality of perception that manifest with this abstract quality, this vernacular of layering and gesture and the brush stroke. So if you could just introduce us to the works in that broad sense.
So I suppose I never really thought of myself as an abstract painter. Or a figurative painter. I sort of think of myself as a painter, and I always looked at abstraction and saw relationships, figure-ground relationships within it. And looking at figuration, I always saw abstraction within figuration. So that idea of being one or the other was just something that wasn't ever going to really happen. And I was kind of interested in how we perceive information. The whole thing I always say is like sort of the speed of light. By the time I look at you, you look at me, that's not necessarily what we're seeing, and that we can't really see anything concretely in the moment. So I was very interested in, on one hand, things that are very rational and, kind of like, kind of understood in that way, and then the emotional reality of being human. So it's kind of very much about that, and trying to find a language that addresses that experience. And within the paintings themselves, like it's there's lots of things at play. There's the spatial relationships. Like I might start out by making drawings and by looking at images and collecting things and amalgamating them, but then I allow my own imagination and also the memory of how to construct space materially take over. And within that kind of dialogue as well, there's, I never wanted to be straightforward. Like sometimes in the beginning they have this very straightforward relationship, and then I get kind of bored and disinterested, and it's the other senses that come into play, like the sensation of being in a space, or the effect of music and musical logic on interpretation. All of those things start to come into play. And I suppose for all intents and purposes, then it creates these other relationships within the painting, like the color bars that appear to float on top. Like they relate to lots of different things for me. Like they're like chords in music, or bits of neon gas, or almost even like the staff and musical notation. So it's a combination of all those things that kind of creates the language that, and each painting is so different then, because it's a different experience each time.
And it's really interesting to think of each piece as touching on a different experience, or sort of an individuated experience. And one of the reasons I wanted to, in the text that I wrote for the show, to think a little bit about this idea of blurring, is that the works do seem to implode this sense of, the moment of sight, the moment of visual perception, but before sort of full apprehension or cognition, like what happens in that sort of interface. And then the works do also speak to, as you say, you have this relationship with different places and documentation of landscapes and things like that, but in a more condensed way. There's that, the moment that you see something and then you turn, and what happens in the moment that you turn away, and what's been loaded onto the initial moment of sensation or perception in that way. So there is that lovely counterforce of, like you say, kind of rational reality or objective reality, and then the emotional reality or the sensory reality. And that we have all of these sort of pockets of of alternating moments in an installation like this in the gallery space?
I suppose I'm not really sure what you're asking me there.
Oh no, I'm just sort of waxing lyrical. No question. But I could ask you to talk a little bit more directly about. Well, maybe we could talk about music more specifically first.
Well, I think that I realize that it has a huge effect on how I make a painting, because I initially couldn't have music in the studio because I saw it as a separate experience, it was so structural for me that it would kind of not work at the same time as painting. And then I got over that, and now the whole thing is amalgamated, because it definitely does something to the paintings. And
I heard you talking about Max Richter's sleep cycle.
Yeah. I just thought that was a really interesting idea, the neuroscience of sleep, and trying to find musical composition that deals with the different stages of sleep and responds to that, and the tempo. I think when you're talking about music, you're talking about rhythm and tempo within the paintings, and the kind of rhythmic flow and the stopping and the starting, and the idea of kind of moments of focus, and then this other kind of underlying melody or something like that kind of structural stuff. That goes off into a tangent then about music, which I don't think that's completely where I want them to go either. They're not about any one thing. They're about a conflation of senses, I think, and to try and make them kind of, and also I suppose, you can't make paintings like this without being aware of art history either, and I'm completely aware of the history of painting, and always kind of fascinated by that, and
I wonder then, would it be a nice moment to lead into Joan Mitchell and how you've been?
Well, Joan Mitchell as a painter, I always thought was really fascinating, because there's such there's such an overwhelming sense of clashing colour, which I always loved, but there's lots of painters, I suppose it's great to see somebody like Joan Mitchell more appreciated now than maybe 30 years ago. So, and there's all that history about relooking at all those painters, and particularly the female painters from that era. But I suppose, there are so many painters, that kind of were like moments for me where I kind of, learn something, and some of them are not that obvious. They don't it goes back to things like Holbein, the arm in the portrait of Thomas More, which is this electric red velvet arm. And always looked to me like it was infrared. I just saw infrared light, but that's not possible because it's like 1537 or something. And so you think about, there's also viewing things with 21st century eyes and knowledge. And when you view the past, you put things on it that aren't there, or maybe they were there and they just didn't have the language or the knowledge to realize that they somehow tapped into it. And so I find all that stuff really fascinating as well. So I always talk a little bit about like I love neon, But
and the color bars, I've heard you talk as well about the color bars on a malfunctioning television set.
So I that was another thing. Like a lot of the sort of like screens and the shifting ground initially came from one painting from about like 2005 called Parallel Universe, which was a broken television set, and with just the color card on it, and then it started to shift from there. And I really like the idea that the TV was broken, and that the lines of communication were broken, and there was a disconnect. And quite interested again, that disconnect between looking at something in the moment and not being able to see it in the moment, or misunderstandings or misunderstood information, or just general how things evolve in human experience from something that may not be accurate in the first place. I always found that really interesting.
It becomes part of reality.
Well, it becomes our reality.
And the Velázquez sleeves as well.
And the dresses, the Las Meninas. I always thought they were really fascinating as abstract paintings. When you look at them, and the characters, the infantas, are almost like irrelevant. It's almost like the dresses are wearing the girls. And I always thought they were amazing as paintings. So I'm big. I was a huge fan of Velázquez, Diego Velázquez, and so there's a lot.
Well, I suppose when I heard you talk about that piece in particular, I was kind of caught by the idea of, the shape of the garments and that sense of a contour. How we have this sense of contours and edges and any sort of surface that's likely to catch the light in a lot of your works. And I wonder, are you invested in contours and edges in a purely geometric way and in that sense of catching the light, or is there that sense of slippage between that blurring again, the misperception and the perception?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think that there are moments where there's a very definite decision about the edges and about the arrangement of color against something that's very definitely allowing a process of erasure and addition and subtraction to form underneath it. So, I think painting is about edges anyway. Yeah. It is about contours and edges and light and trying to do something with those basic things to create something interesting,
And then obviously with the smaller pieces that I know you sometimes call anti-portraits.
Yeah.
And then obviously they're sort of the contours of the human face or the human anatomy then are sort of givens as you go in. So I'm just curious how your relationship to these less abstract pieces.
I think that I kind of have this way of working where I really enjoy making really large pieces, and they're one reality. And in order for the large pieces to flow, I also make really small paintings simultaneously. And the small ones tend to be quite direct and succinct, and they tend to then create a tension with the larger work, so they talk to each other. And I always think of a show as being like a piece of prose or something, and the smaller ones are like punctuation marks in it or something. And it's sort of like something that I need to do. I need to. I think as well, like in the paintings, there's human presence in all of them, even when they're their most abstract. They're not meant to be devoid of that. There is that sense of that's something that's important. So I suppose that comes out in the portraits then, that is what they are. And I call them anti-portraits because my relationship to portraiture isn't straightforward. It's almost like I do and I don't want to, and it's like there is an identity, but there isn't. And even within a lot of the paintings where figures might appear, it's like a neon digital strip of light and a shadow, but maybe there's nobody there actually at all, and it kind of alludes to that over and over again, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose then, well, if we think about these individual pieces as punctuation mark, the anti-portraits as the sense of a punctuation mark or, a comma maybe, which then would lead us to think about breath and taking a breath in a process of a body of work, a body of painterly work or a sentence. At what stage do you think it's time to step back from one of the bigger pieces and to focus, or is it quite intuitive, or is it to do with something practical like letting the paint dry?
It's a mixture, because it's partially like there's a certain flow, and sometimes the paintings go through different stages as well where they really flow and then they don't, and then you get kind of destructive. And when you get destructive, it's usually a good thing in the long run, but it can be very upsetting. It can be really stressful. And then I go to the portraits straight away as a way of coping with that chaos. And then I go back to the chaos again and start reordering it, So it's like an organizational process of chaos and order balancing out all the time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And then given that, I don't know the answer to this question, are any of the larger pieces, I know you've talked before about pieces being kind of composites or long-term studies of a particular place?
Not really, no. Yeah. I mean, I have done that where I'd used my own home and my own childhood home, but not really. Okay. I think that's something, sometimes I think there are things that I've talked about in the past, and I think I've internalized them at this stage. They're probably still there, but they feel very internalized at this stage. Yeah.
And then yet there's still, I suppose, and one of the reasons before I knew that you felt any sort of kinship to Joan Mitchell, one of the reasons that I had sort of put the two of you in pictorial conversation in my mind was the sense of, you're looking at a large scale piece that is so abstract, and yet there's something about the play of light that makes you think of how light functions in a landscape. And it might not be when you're fully inhabiting that landscape, but again, that kind of turn, you turn away, or you're on the bus, or you're walking, or something like that. But I was going to ask that if any of how the smaller pieces, the more directly figurative pieces, are they also composites? Are they are they sort of, composites, memories of people? Are they particular people, or does it matter?
They're all of those things.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a particular person, sometimes it's an idea about how a person could be represented, and sometimes it's nobody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And something else then that I was thinking about, again, in relation to Joan Mitchell, was this sense of the physiological response that we have to colour. And I know that you have obviously a very particular relationship to colour and a very particular relationship to oil painting and to the medium and the materiality of oil. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where that intersects for you, the use of colour and that charged response that we can have as viewers, or I suppose the connotations we all hold with particular colours. Like you could maybe say with neon that there's something automatically liberating or electric about neon, and the viewer brings that with them. And so we have that physiological response, and then through the medium, through oil, through the materiality of oil. And again, I know you have a particular relationship to oil. So could you talk about if and when those two concerns overlap?
Yeah, okay. I think that like I had this process of looking at oil painting, and you know, the kind of the way we look at light and trying to get that sense of light into the paintings. And initially it might have been a more sort of naturalistic light, but then I started to think about, you know, the way the world is lit, you know, because I think when we look at art history, you know, the world was lit in a very different way for everybody. Like there was candles, basically, when you look back to the time of Velasquez, and you look at the 20th, 21st century, and there's so many light sources, you know, that I think that was just my experience of reality coming in, that it was happening naturally. And, you know, how screens are lit or how the world is lit, like you can walk down a completely pink street and not even realize that it's strange or could be viewed as being strange, you know. And then I suppose, you know, things like, again, you know, looking back at art history and looking at when things were invented and how that, you know, how curious that is, you know, even things like neon gas, you know, it's curious, like it's, you know, it's just a curiosity, you know, that it's only 100 and something years old, and that it's, you know, the 5th most abundant gas in the universe, but not on Earth. I love stuff. I'm a bit of a nerd, actually, basically. So there's the nerdy side kicks in, and I just think that's really interesting as a kind of like as a moment within a composition to somehow insert this almost like a extraterrestrial element, you know. And so but lighting, I mean, there's so many different ways to think about lighting, and then I suppose there is your own kind of internal palette as well. You know, you instinctively, like I instinctively like white, because with white you create the sense of light, and there's a sense of space created by white as well, and then the mixing of white and the tonal variation. You know, it does something spatially, visually. And they're all things that interest me in terms of how I use colour. So I don't know if I've really answered that, or if I've gone off on a few tangents there.
No, definitely you've answered it. I'm just so curious about, I suppose I wanted to frame the question in that way because I know that the pieces I feel them to be these sort of deep perceptive studies, and that though you're concerned with the objective quality of material perception to a degree, you're also coming at it from this very subjective and nuanced place. And again, these varied individual instances. And I suppose at what point that feeds into or is in conversation with some of the broader disciplines that, like you say, you're kind of interested in, like optics or neuroscience. And I'm very curious to hear about any of the fiction work that you've been reading as well, because I know you like you're a fan of the short sentence.
I like Murakami for that. But I think at the moment I've been painting a lot and listening a lot. I haven't been reading a lot, so I'm still reading Murakami. But I do like that. I like that as kind of, you know, and
it's interesting as well if we think about that sense of flow and linguistic flow and the stream of thoughts in the brain, and again, like if you're listening to literary material like that, and how it might manifest in these series of points of breath within a body of work like this, and how it sits in a space. And
well, I think when you're reading, again, you're conjuring up all these images, and it does feed into how you into a painting. I mean, it acts like as a springboard, and because they have titles, and sometimes the titles help finish the painting, because it becomes something, it's hovering on the edge of being many things, and all of a sudden it's kind of shoehorns it into a space, and that can be the link back to language, the words, but yeah, like, I mean, it's like I have a lot of things that I kind of drift in and out of doing, but my main preoccupation is definitely painting.
Yeah. Oh no, definitely. Yeah. But maybe then, before I open it up and ask if anyone has any questions, would you talk just a little bit more about, I've heard you speak very briefly before about your relationship, as I kind of mentioned earlier, just the materiality of oil, and I think you called it like primeval or medieval or something.
Probably it's very primal. Yeah, like it's like, you talk about all these ways of interpreting the world, and it's, we are where we are with, technology, and but it's still a very basic thing to make a mark. And oil paint, it's basically a kind of mud, colored mud, and it's really, I still think, really kind of like the handmade or the human touch, and trying to deal with these kind of very contemporary issues in lots of ways. It's kind of, I don't know, I think it's still very relevant.
And for you, so oil is sort of the most deft, or the most, would it be fair to say, direct way to make a mark? Or
well, I draw as well, and I do use water-based paint as well, like watercolor and stuff, and acrylic and stuff. But I actually really like, there's something about the weight of oil paint and the way it slides around, and also the fact that while it's wet, you have to balance things. You have to be very decisive, because it'll turn into mud. It can go completely grey, and to try and catch it and get sort of like the mid-tones in the paintings are very important. They have this sort of like, what I would call the grayscale, and the what I would always refer to as a hierarchy colors operate with the grayscale, and it's a balancing act, because if you're not mentally present in the moment when you're painting, it'll turn to mud, it'll all go grey, and so it's kind of challenging, oil painting, in that way, and that
and you're so aware of time and time passing.
There's a time element as well, that in terms of what you can do, and the decisions you can make, and how you have to sit with those decisions while you're in that moment. It's a balancing act.
Yeah. And so with the drawing works then, would you elaborate a little bit? Are the drawings always preparatory before you go into a bigger piece, or do they come in along the way as well?
It can be both. Sometimes you have to draw for a painting, because if you get something about the composition that gets stuck or something, it doesn't quite flow, or work. So you have to draw to resolve it. And sometimes they are just things in themselves, and other times they are serving the painting. So it's a combination of different reasons. You know?
And then, I suppose, seeing as you have made this progression, or not progression, but a certain shift in scale, would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think about like 7 years ago, I started showing a lot in New York, so it started to mean that the scale changed, because there was a different audience, and it was really good for me, because again, like the large paintings, it is like a completely different process. It's almost like a theatre set, moving things around and organising things in a different way. And I was asking, I suppose, in relation to time, and that sense of how, the temporality of oil obviously must shift quite dramatically when you're dealing with a much bigger canvas. But that sense of spatial components, it's actually easier in lots of ways, because there's more surface. So if one area has become saturated, there's always another area you can move to, and you can go on. The mid-sized ones are actually the hardest, because it's more like,
and by mid-size you mean this sort of size?
No, probably those ones, because that's like it's all happening at the same time, but it's not very small, because the small ones, they can just be obliterated, and you can start again, and the big ones, it's compartmentalized a bit more. So it's so slightly different process, or for each sort of scale, actually.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.